Welcome to Cantini. My name is Paul Herbert. I'm the director of the 1st Division Museum at Cantini. This is not the 1st Division Museum, but this is a 1st Division Museum program, and we're delighted to have you here. I think most of you have been to Cantini many times, but if you'll bear with me, Cantini is the historic home of the late Colonel Robert R. McCormick, longtime owner, editor, and publisher of the Chicago Tribune, who lived here on this estate, and when he passed away in 1955, he left it as a park for the people of Illinois. If you have come from Iowa or Wisconsin or Indiana, you are equally welcome. He also left his very considerable wealth at that time to establish what is now our parent organization, the Robert R. McCormick Foundation, whose headquarters are on Michigan Avenue in Chicago. The foundation is a major philanthropy that does approximately $50 million worth of charitable grants a year. I have nothing to do with them, so save it. The colonel, second only to the Chicago Tribune in the colonel's heart, was the 1st Division of the United States Army, in which he served as a volunteer citizen soldier at the age of 37 in World War I. He fought in America's first battle for Europe at Cantini, a tiny village north of Paris, France. And when he came home from the war profoundly affected, he renamed this estate Cantini to honor the battle and his fellow veterans. And he was devoted to the 1st Division, the United States Army, veterans in general, and our service members for the rest of his days. It is because of that we have a museum to the 1st Division here at Cantini. The 1st Division was founded in 1917 for World War I when the colonel joined it, and has been on continuous active duty every single day since. It now has 20,000 soldiers at Fort Riley, Kansas, and its commanding general and headquarters are in Baghdad, where they're helping the Iraqi Ministry of Defense confront ISIS. An unbroken 98-year history of service to our country. At the end of World War II, and it's this month, we observe the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II in 1945. And it's very, very important that we should observe that momentous moment, that momentous day. It wasn't the end of World War II, of course. It continued another several months in the Pacific against Japan. But it so profoundly affected the world into which almost everybody in this room was born, and everybody in this room has lived since. And we owe a great debt to the GIs and the sailors and the Marines and the airmen and all of the others who helped bring about the unconditional surrender of our Axis enemies. In the waning months of World War II, there are many, many things that we could say. One of the things that I think we ought to remember, our memory of World War II sort of starts with Normandy, even though we were fighting in the Mediterranean for years before we landed in Normandy. And then it sort of goes to the Battle of the Bulge, and the next moment is VE Day. And we forget all the hard fighting in between those milestones. From the end of the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 until the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany in May of 1945, as many American soldiers were killed or wounded in action as in the preceding 6 months. The fighting was every bit as hard, and it lasted right to the last moment. The 1st Division ended the war in Czechoslovakia. And one of the last things it did before the war ended was to liberate 2 tiny satellite camps of a major concentration camp at Flossenburg on the hotly disputed border between Germany and Czechoslovakia. And we have photographs in our archives, and we have film footage in our archives of the horrors that 1st Division soldiers encountered there. GIs all across Germany, as the Third Reich crumbled, encountered the system of camps that the Nazis had created in order to exterminate those people who they felt had no right to life in the world that they were attempting to create. And the experience of our GIs and the survivors that they liberated and the photographs that they took and the letters that they wrote home and the news reports that came home and their personal experience provided undeniable, positive proof of the extent of the terrible crimes perpetrated by the Nazi regime, crimes against humanity, an idea that was first invoked at the Nuremberg trials at the end of World War II. There are educated people in our country today who want us to believe it didn't happen. And they must be opposed. And so, in honor of the 70th anniversary of VE Day and our educational mission to introduce American citizens to some of our military history, we decided it would be appropriate to bring two people as our guests tonight who were there and can tell this story far more effectively than I can or any of our staff can or that we can in the exhibits of a museum. Because, after all, it is our responsibility to contemplate those horrors and not the fact that they were particularly German, but that they were human. And to think what it is we should do, what should our children do, what should our grandchildren know and do, in the hopes that nothing like this can be repeated on the same scale with the same viciousness as was true in the 1940s, notwithstanding the fact that there are other horrors in our own time which we have a responsibility also to confront. So that's sort of the theme of what we're doing tonight. I want to introduce these two wonderful gentlemen that I've just had the pleasure of sharing a meal with. On your right, our left first, is Dr. George W. Brent. Dr. Brent is a native of Czechoslovakia. He's a retired dentist. He is a member of the faculty of the University of Illinois College of Dentistry. He practiced dentistry for 50 years, and he taught prosthodontics at the university for over 29 years. He is currently retired and lives with his wife Nancy in Wilmette, Illinois. He has 3 daughters here in the Chicago area and a 4th who lives in Colorado. 6 of 8 grandchildren live in Chicago. The other 2, not surprisingly, in Colorado. Dr. Brent, I'll let him tell his story, but he was incarcerated by the Nazis in Czechoslovakia at the age of 14 and miraculously survived experiences in the concentration camp at Auschwitz and at Mauthausen, and eventually was liberated by American soldiers, came to the United States, again miraculously with his father, also a concentration camp inmate, served in the Korean War in the United States Air Force, became a citizen in 1955, and has done all of the good that I just described for all of us with teeth. The other gentleman on your left and my right is Mr. Arthur Sheridan. Art is a native of Chicago. He graduated from Senn High School and joined the Army at the age of 17 in 1942. He arrived in Europe after the D-Day invasion in Normandy and fought his way across France and into Germany. He fought in the Battle of the Bulge. Outside Munich, Germany, as a member of the 60th Infantry Battalion, 20th Armored Division, He was one of the very first soldiers to find and enter and eventually liberate the concentration camp at Dachau, Germany. A teenager at the time, he wasn't fully aware of all that he was witnessing, but the memories have stayed with him most powerfully. Like so many GIs, he came home from the war, returned to his father's business in Chicago, put those memories well aside, and pursued a very, very successful series of careers in a variety of businesses in which he is still very much engaged and very busy. It is a great pleasure to introduce and welcome Dr. George Brent and Mr. Arthur Sheridan. Please join me in a round of welcoming applause. We're going to ask Dr. Brent to speak first about his experiences, and then without any Q&A, we're going to move directly to Mr. Sheridan. And when both gentlemen have spoken to us for a little while, there will be time for Q&A, and I'm sure all of us will have a number of things that we want to ask both of these gentlemen. So, Dr. Brent, I will welcome you to the podium and ask you to speak to us.
Thank you, Paul. Good evening. Can you hear me? Yes. Good evening. It so happens it's a very memorable day today. May 27th of 1944 is the day I arrived in Auschwitz-Birkenau. It's the 71st anniversary of my getting there, so it's kind of serendipitous that I am speaking to you on the day when I arrived. And when I arrived, I really didn't know what was going on and if I ever will leave that place. But that's my story. I was born, as Paul mentioned, in Czechoslovakia, the son of a pharmacist in a small town of Tečevo, a small 12,000 people. There were about 600 Jewish families. We had a good life, my father being the pharmacist in the small town, and I was the firstborn. I was the heir apparent, apparently, and my little brother followed me about 5 years later, and we had a small family in a beautiful house, and we had a really good life. I started my schooling, and everything went smoothly till 1939 when the war broke out. What happened, of course, you may know the history, that Hitler decided to dismember Czechoslovakia, and Czechoslovakia was a wonderful country, the only democratic country in the whole of Europe. There were kingdoms and fiefdoms all over the place, and the democracy of Czechoslovakia was really an example to follow. There were so many different nationalities, but they all somehow were able to get along. But that stopped when the Hungarians came in 1939, and they took over the northern portion, the northeastern portion, the Carpathian area of Czechoslovakia, and it became Hungary. Now, I was a kid of 10 years old at the time. 1939, I was going to my 4th grade in the Czech elementary school, and from one day to the next, all of a sudden, I had to go to a Hungarian school. Luckily, I did speak Hungarian. My parents spoke Hungarian. I had a German nanny, so I spoke German, which my mother tongue is I really don't know anymore, but it was probably Hungarian. But I also speak German. So I had to switch language all of a sudden. I started my 4th grade as a Czech school, and then I finished it in the Hungarian school. And things started changing quickly. The Hungarians weren't as nice to us as the Czechs were. Immediately, I was a 10-year-old kid. I really didn't feel it, but I could see what's going on there. All of a sudden, there were laws passed in Hungary that discriminated against the Jewish population. They weren't allowed to attend certain schools. There was what they called a numerus clausus, meaning that only a certain percentage of Jews were allowed into higher education. They had to leave the businesses. They couldn't be professionals. They kept the professionals in the little town of Tečevo that I'm from simply because there were no other people who were physicians or dentists or pharmacists like my father to take care of the small population. And we were surrounded by little villages all around that there was no way to get there except by horse-drawn carriages, perhaps. There were no trains. The only train station we had was in Teacher. And that played a very important part for the reason that I was taken from that place, because the trains were able to come to Teacher. Things went rather smoothly. I mean, a kid, you understand, when I was from 10 years on till 1944, where things got pretty tough. All of a sudden, the Germans got kind of fed up with the fact that a large number of Jews were still living freely in a country with families like Hungary. They just couldn't stand the idea. So when Hungary was sort of hesitant to deport the Jews, they just came in and occupied Hungary and immediately set up a puppet government. And the Hungarians, I must say, were quite ready to deal with the so-called Jewish question, which was laying on their minds for all these years. They wanted to have a Jew-free Hungary. And they were prepared. When the Germans came and they helped them, give him the idea that now you can do with the Jews as you will, they immediately had put it to, they started implementing some of the things that they were ready to do so for quite a while. The first thing they did, of course, like they did in every other country that they occupied, of course, around there in Poland, in other countries where they had the ghettos, the first thing they did, they had to make sure that everybody recognized the Jews, which meant you had to wear a yellow star. Next thing was, of course, we couldn't attend the schools anymore. We had to give up our radios. We had to give up things that were telephones, for example. The businesses were taken away from the Jews. And it all of a sudden, I mean, you have to understand, I was not quite 14 years old. I couldn't quite understand that things were happening. All I know that people calling me names. They were sometimes beating up on me because I was a Jew and I had a yellow star on. It was kind of strange because these were neighbors of mine. These were kids I grew up with, I went to school with, and all of a sudden they turned on me. I just couldn't understand why this was happening. It was May the 21st, I believe, of 1944, on a Monday morning, while all the other Jews from our town were already in what they called a ghetto. It wasn't a real little big ghetto like the ones in Warsaw or Lodz, Poland. It was an area where they had the Gentiles move out and the Jews were moved in. They had to get rid of the furniture and the empty rooms, and they just gathered all the Jews from the town and put them into these homes that were left empty by the Gentile population. At 7 in the morning on a Monday morning, May 20th or 21st, I believe it was, a Monday morning, there was a knock on the door. My father followed to open the door. I was behind him, wondering what's going on. My little brother was behind me, 10-year-old little Peter, and my mother. There were two gendarmes in the Hungarian garb that they wore, a long green coat with a black hat and a cock feather. These were Hungarians. They were specially trained for this. In other words, they were ready to do the bidding that Eichmann and his henchmen did up in Budapest. They were directing the whole thing, and the Hungarians were all set to do their bidding. They gave us an hour to get out of the house, take what we could with us, and we had to march into the ghetto. And before we even left the house, all of a sudden, my neighbors, my friends, my colleagues, my kids I went to school with, came into the house and started plundering. They asked me, well, I'll take your bicycle. You won't have a need for it right now. We'll give it back to you when you come back. You have an accordion there. I'll take that. I'll take care of it. Don't worry about it. When you come back, I'll give it back to you. And they started taking things out of our house, and of course we couldn't do a thing. We just had to stand by, gather a few things that we had, and they marched us into this ghetto. They put about 2 or 3 families in an empty room. We had a mattress on the floor. And to a 14-year-old kid, it was kind of surreal. I mean, I just didn't know what to make of it. I mean, I figured, well, what did I do wrong? I mean, I'm a Jew. I never hurt anyone. I'm always a good boy, so to speak. I did what my parents wanted me to do. I was a good student, a very good student. And why would they do this to us? Well, they did it. We spent one day in that little ghetto. On a Wednesday morning, early, they made us get up, stand in a line on the street with the families, children, old people, young people, people who could barely walk. Some were pushed in their wheelchairs. Some were just supported with a cane or by other people. And they started marching us towards the railroad station. And all the population of the little town was standing by on the side of the road looking at us. And you think they would have shed a tear or said something awful is happening? I don't think so. Nothing happened. Nobody lifted a finger. If anything, they were kind of glad that we are gone. Now they have access to all the things we had. They can take possession of. They took us to the railroad station. Overnight, they put us into a holding pen where animals were kept, or usually kept. We spent the night there. On Thursday morning, early, we got out. And let me tell you, this was all done by Hungarians. I didn't see a German till I got to the railroad station, and the train stood there, about 30 cars, these cattle cars. And there was a German officer who was in charge of the train. It's the first German I saw in this whole situation. Later, of course, I read about the whole thing, and I knew very well that now the Hungarian government had plenty of people in charge now who prepared for this deportation of the Jews of Hungary. Now you have to understand, there were about 720,000 Jews living in the greater Hungary. 450,000 Jews were deported in a matter of 10 weeks. If you have the calculator, you can figure out how many people had to be deported each day. 147 trains, about 2,000 to 3,000 people at each train, and sometimes 2 to 3 trains arriving in Auschwitz. They put us into these cattle cars, about 80 to 100 people with children, old people, young people, sick people, didn't matter. And for the trip, they gave us 2 buckets. One bucket was with water, for water. The other bucket was to use as the thing to relieve yourself in. That was it. They shut the doors and the train started moving. There were people at the station looking at us. Again, you think they shed a tear or looked sad about it? I didn't see it. Anyway, the train started moving. At the Slovak border, as we were heading north, the Hungarians gave up the control of the train and the SS Germans took over. We traveled on for another day or so. It was a Saturday morning, a beautiful sunny day. The train came to a sudden stop, wondering where were we. But in the meantime, being in a cattle car with 100 people, or 80 to 100 people with children, and can you imagine, I think it's surreal what happened there. People were crying. They were, I can't even, it was a chaos. It was a horrible thing. It was an inferno. It was like Dante's Inferno. It was surreal. Can you imagine people trying to go to the bucket to relieve themselves in front of all the other people? There was no privacy. Finally, some people took a blanket and covered them with so that they were able to do their thing. Of course, that bucket wasn't big enough to hold everybody's secretions. It started overflowing. The stench was awful. The water was gone. Thank God the journey came to an end pretty fast. My father looked out a little window when the train stopped, and in the station there was a sign of the little station in Gothic lettering that said Auschwitz. My father, we never heard this word before. We didn't know what Auschwitz was. But my father looked at it and he said, it's in Gothic lettering. This must be the occupied Poland by Germans. And the Germans are rather civilized people. They wouldn't hurt us much. I mean, after all, they are the people of Goethe and Schiller and all the famous people. They are pretty civilized people. Well, of course, he was wrong. The train moved on for another mile and a half, and we stopped at another station at Auschwitz-Birkenau. The Birkenau was the gathering place where all the Jews of Europe were dumped, so to speak. Some of them were left to stay alive, others were not. Matter of fact, may I have the bottle, please? I have to wet my whistle here. Thank you. Out of the some 450,000 Jews that were shipped to Auschwitz in a matter of 10 weeks, 80% of them were immediately gassed and killed. Those who stayed alive went through the selection. There was a ramp where we got off the train. I will show you some slides at the end. Luckily, or unluckily, luckily I found these pictures, really. It's in an Auschwitz album, it's called. You can get it and you can look at this whole thing because it was the story of my transport. Why they took pictures particularly of my transport, but they did it. It was called the story of a transport. And they followed from our arrival till the gates to the gas chamber. Didn't show the killings, but you could pretty well imagine what was going on. It was a chaos on the ramp, but it was a planned chaos. As soon as we got off the ramp, there was a mixture of SS with canes and dogs, and there was also mixed amongst them some prisoners in their striped uniforms. They were all trained to take care of the arrivals without causing any panic. You can imagine their mothers with children who had to give up their kids, or if they didn't want to, they were sent to the side. Nobody forced you to give up your child if you didn't want to, even though you may have been young enough to survive, but they didn't want to create a scene here. So if you didn't want to leave your kid, that's okay, you go to the other side, with all the old people, the sick people, and the infirm people. I stood in line in front of a SS doctor, I guess, an SS officer, and he stood there. We were in a row of 5, and we marched in front of everyone, in front of him, and he, with his thumb, I remember standing there like this, with his thumb, he just pointed left to right, and that decided whether you're going to live or die. I guess at age 14, a little older than 14, I looked old enough or tall enough. They pointed me to the right, and I went to the camp, and my father followed as well. My mother and my brother, I found out later what happened to them, of course, but the last I saw them getting off the train, and at the corner of my eye I saw them getting off the open door. I had no chance to even say goodbye or kiss them or say I'll see you later. But that's the last time I saw them alive, period. Later on, I found out that that horrible stench that we smelled as we got off, the burning of the flames and the smoke coming out of the chimneys of these 2 buildings at the end of the ramp there. Somebody told us there are bakeries. Well, nonsense. Bread never smelled like that. Of course, we didn't know what they were burning there. We found out pretty soon. So as we got into the camp, there were some people there who've been there for quite a while, and they were very anxious to tell us where your family that you're looking for is. They went up in smoke, and that's what they did. So they were, in a matter of a day or so, they were killed immediately after they arrived in Auschwitz. Now you have to understand, there were 5 crematories in Auschwitz-Birkenau. They could kill 10,000 people a day. A gas chamber held 2,000 humans at that same time. I can't even fathom the horror of a mother with his child, with men and women naked, forced into this chamber. I mean, can you imagine being stripped naked in front of everybody and pushed into this chamber? They have much time to think about anything. They told them, remember the hooks where you put your clothes because you're going to come out and you'll need it, so on and so forth. They shut the door on them, and they were dead within 15 to 20 minutes. They used the prussic acid, Cyclone B, they called it, cyanide. And of course, they had a commando that worked in the gas chambers and in the crematories that had to dispose of the bodies, bring them into the crematories where they had the ovens, and they were trying to burn them. Towards the end, ovens weren't sufficient enough, so they burned them in open pits. But disposing of 10,000 people a day, it wasn't easy. And if you think about the numbers, I mean, we are upset when one of your family members passes away. That's one person that you are close to. All of a sudden, you can't even fathom that there are thousands and thousands of people, innocent people, being put to death. My father and I entered the camp, got our first striped uniforms, but after a couple of days, we were separated. I was put in the children's barracks. My father left. He came, I remember he found where I was, and he came to say goodbye because he was shipped to Warsaw, Poland, to clean up the Jewish ghetto that was in rubble now because there was an uprising in 1943. Of course, the Germans destroyed it. So they were people from Auschwitz shipped there to clean up the rubble. I stayed in that children barracks for a while before they put us into the general population in the men's camp. And while I was there, I met my uncle, who preceded me by a couple of weeks, but he was a very crafty guy. He became a Schreiber, they call it in German, which means he worked in the office. He had an armband that said Schreiber, which gave him a certain amount of prestige. He was able to move around the camp itself more freely than we could. And when he saw me, he said, "George, I got to tell you something." He says, "Just because you weren't selected immediately to go to the gas chamber, it's not over yet. If I tell you that there's going to be a selection in barracks number, let's say 12 or 13 or 20, I don't want you to stay there overnight. I want you to go to another barracks, because that night they're going to have another selection there." And what they did periodically, they looked at the prisoners who were still alive, and if they looked sick, if they looked emaciated, unfit for work, they were selected and put aside, and next morning they came with the trucks and took them to the gas chambers. So in a way, he was my guardian angel and my savior, because I really didn't know what the heck to do there, a 14-year-old kid. But after about 3-4 months, dodging bullets, not bullets necessarily, but beatings, because everybody had a stick, or everybody had some sort of a contraption that you could beat with. It's not just the SS. You didn't see much of the SS in the camp itself. The prisoners were in charge of the administration of the camp. And these were people who preceded me. There were some Poles, there were some French, and the most savage ones were the Germans. There were German criminals who were selected from the German prisons and brought into Auschwitz to become heads of the capos, which are people in charge of the work commandos, heads of barracks, and so on and so forth. They wore a green triangle, and they got the job because they were cruel. They could kill at will. They had privileges, they had food, they had clothing, they even access to women if they wanted it. After about 3-4 months, I think it was the early fall, all of a sudden I couldn't find my uncle anymore. I got panicky. I said, "Who's going to take care of me?" My God, time goes so fast when I talk about these things. I found out that he went on a transport to a different subcamp of Auschwitz. And when I found this out, how I did that, I don't know, but I found out it was the transport. They're looking for another group of people for that transport. And I volunteered. I stepped up to the assessment who selected people, and I said, "I'd like to go to this transport." And he said, "Fine." And that was a day also helped me probably survive, because I got my tattoo number. You see, in Auschwitz, arrivals were nobody. It was just a number of people. They were counted every morning, every night, and the count had to be correct. But nobody had an identity. But I got a number now, B10511. That meant that I am a worker person now, and they're going to at least let me work for a while till I cannot work anymore, and then we'll see what's going to happen. So I followed my uncle to this other camp. Again, he had a privilege. He was still working in the camp office. And it was a coal mining camp in Silesia, and instead of letting me work in the coal mines, he assigned me to the SS barracks. I became an orderly, working in a room with 4 SS men who were guards. Now, these were older people, older SS men. They weren't the young SS, Waffen SS that fought on the front lines. These were older SS people who were used as guards. And they had a room where they were bunks, and I had to take care of their clothing, I had to take care of their beds, keep the room clean, and I had some benefits by doing that. Because first of all, I was indoors, not in a coal mine where the others worked. I also had some extra food because these people always had plenty of food and they left something over, and they gave me some. They also got packages from home, so I was able to get fed pretty well. And it was warm. Winter was already at hand. So while other people were freezing and not having enough to eat and starving, dying, I was in pretty good shape. When January 5th came along, in 1945, all of a sudden they made us get up in the middle of winter, which is very, very cold. No winter clothing. We had the same old light striped uniforms. And we were marched. They called it a death march, I guess, because a lot of people died from freezing, or they fell by the wayside, they were shot, or left on the roadside to freeze. They took us to a railroad head in Gliwice, Polish. They put us into these open coal cars and shipped us across Bohemia to Austria to another wonderful camp called Mauthausen. Now, Mauthausen wasn't called an extermination camp, but they did exterminate people not by gas chambers, but by overworking, by not feeding it, by disease, by beating, by whatever. It was a quarry. There are these huge boulders that they had to carry up some hundreds of stairs, and if they couldn't do it, they collapsed and they dragged the rest of the people with them, or they were just beaten to death, period. So life didn't mean much. I spent a few days there, a week maybe, because it was so crowded. Now all the prisoners from the east were coming west. And from Mauthausen, they shipped me to a sub-camp of Mauthausen, another one also called a pretty horrible camp called Ebensee. It was originally designed for maybe 10,000 people. Now we had 30,000 people. So it was overcrowded. There was not enough food. There was not enough anything. And we had to work now. I had no more privileges. I worked in these mountains, building these tunnels where the Germans had their hardware and armament hidden from the bombings and so on and so forth. It was hard work with very little food. And by the time May came around, May 1945, I don't know what I weighed. There's no way of weighing myself, but I know I was very, very thin. You could see my bones through my skin, and I was getting weaker and weaker by the day. All I thought about is food, eating, and surviving from day to day. And one morning, they didn't get us up at 4:30 in the morning, and they made us stand on the Appellplatz, which is the place where we were counted every morning and night. The commandant, the SS commandant, came and said, "We would like to protect you from any harm that may befall you because the Allies are not too far away. We want you to go into these tunnels that you were building, and that will protect you from any harm." Well, some people knew what was going on because the tunnels were all mined. They were full of dynamite and explosives. They wanted to go in there, and then they would have blown us up to hell, that's all. Well, somebody just stood up to them and said, "No, you can kill us right here on the spot." And there were quite a few of us there, but we're not going anywhere. The commandant was very taken back by somebody speaking back to him. He turned on his heels and he marched out. And a while later, we saw the whole garrison of SS leaving the camp area. They left a few old guards, not the SS, standing to keep us inside the camp. No food, no water. That was, I think, it was May 3rd or so, or 4th. So for about 2-3 days, nobody cared what we're having. No food was given. We ate what we could find, raw potatoes. We found a potato cellar. And we got sick eating. Now, that was just the beginning. Because on I think it was the 7th or so, May, when the war was come to an end, a half-track, an American half-track, that Art here was a member of the, well, you were in Dachau, so not in Ebensee, but you were in charge of a half-track. You had a half-track. Came charging through the gate, crashing through the gate, and a little while later, the whole convoy of American soldiers came in with the Red Cross and the setting up the field hospital and started feeding us. And we ate, and we ate, and we ate whatever they gave us. And we got sicker and sicker and sicker because we couldn't handle the food. Our stomachs just couldn't handle it. People were dying by the thousands after liberation. Some of them were beyond help. And those who were still okay, They overate to the point where they got so sick that they just passed away. They got dysentery, diarrhea, and whatever else. After a week or two, they told us we have to repatriate you. You go back to where you came from. I said, well, I don't know. I don't know what the heck it is. Well, you go east. We got to put you on a train, and we shipped you towards Hungary. In Budapest, I got off the train. I remember that two of my great aunts lived in Budapest. Now, that was the only city in Hungary where the Jews were not deported from. They stopped the deportations in first part of July, I guess end of June, for political reasons. I don't know what the reason really was. But anyway, I found my aunts. And while I was there, of course, they were surprised to see this little guy in a German uniform. That's all our clothing I had, and found an old German uniform. But they got a telegram. He remembered also that they may be alive, and a Red Cross telegram arrived from my father that I'm alive, I'm very ill, I'm in a sanatorium having tuberculosis in Germany. So when I found that out, of course, my first thought was how to go and join my father. It wasn't so easy because the borders were already closing, and we just couldn't pass through borders like we could before. And it took me a while. I also went home to look at what was left of my house, but there was nothing there. They ripped the house apart. The door jambs, the windows, everything was just taken. They were looking for some treasures, I guess, that they thought my father was hiding. Anyway, I tried to get to see my dad. There's no way I could get out. I crossed the border a couple of times. They caught me. They beat me up and sent me back to Hungary. Finally, I found a Zionist group, a bunch of young Jewish boys and girls who was trying to get to Palestine. There was no Israel at that time, but their dream was to go to the land of Israel, which was created much later. And I joined their group, and I was able to pass through the borders. They had all kinds of deals made with the guards, bribing them, and so on and so forth. And I arrived in Germany. I knew the place where my father was, and in September of 1946, which was about, a year and a half after, or more, almost 2 years since I did see my dad, I went to the sanatorium where he was, and I saw my dad again. Of course, you can imagine the joy and happiness that happened seeing him again. Of course, I couldn't stay in a sanatorium. I was a kid. They put me in a DP camp with children, which was a nice place, a beautiful place in Prien am Chiemsee in Bavaria, where we had a pretty good time. Girls on one floor, boys on the other floor, all about my age, 15, 16 years old, 16 mostly. And they started teaching us a trade because they felt if you're going to go somewhere from here, you better not be a burden to the country that you're going to. You should have a trade. So I chose to become a dental technician. And in October of 1949, I finally got my visa that my uncle from Chicago, an old man who had no children, almost totally blind, in the 70s, sent a visa saying that he's going to take care of me when I come. And I arrived in New York Harbor, October 1st, 1949. I was 20 years old with the clothes I wore and a valise that was made of cardboard, and that's all I had. A cousin of mine who was smart enough to leave Hungary in 1938 was at the docks waiting for me. He had a brand new Ford, I remember, and I looked at it. I said, my God, this is America, right? And he took me immediately by the hand, and he was getting a divorce at the time. It's also something that wasn't very common where I came from. And he took me to his girlfriend, and they said, what is your name? It was Balasa, B-A-L-A-S-A, which is a Hungarian name. And she said, what are you going to do with a name like that? We got to find you a name that's easy to pronounce and sounds good. So we took the New York phone book, which is about this thick, and we went through the B's, and look, and there was Brent. And I named George. George Brent was a pretty good sounding name, and if those of you who remember, there was a George Brent Hollywood actor who was a famous actor, good-looking guy, just like me. And so I became George Brent, and my cousin, whose first name was William, I took his first name as my middle name because I never had one. I went to Chicago. My great uncle took me by the hand. He got me my first job for the Parker Pen Company at 90 cents an hour. I got my Social Security number, and that was in October. And June 1950, the Korean War broke out. And guess what? I was eligible for the draft. Not even a citizen. I barely spoke English, and I had to be ready to go to fight for the country. I my great uncle said, he says, look, George, I tell you what, don't wait for the draft. You don't want to go into the Army. Why don't you join another outfit maybe that will teach you better? So I joined the Air Force Reserve Unit at O'Hare Field, which was activated almost immediately, and I found myself in the United States Air Force with my Air Force blues. And I was very proud of the fact. I thought it was a great deal to be in the U.S. Air Force. And when they asked me what I do as a civilian, I said, not much. I'm trained as a dental technician. He says, okay, we'll put you in a dental laboratory at Chanute Field, which is not there anymore. It's near the University of Illinois. And I spent my 22 months of enlistment in the U.S. Air Force in the dental laboratory. I met my future employer, a dentist, also, and when we got separated from the Air Force, I started working for him. In the meantime, my father came over in 1951, and he was in Baltimore for a while, and then when I got out of the Air Force, he joined me in Chicago. I started working for this man in Harvey, Illinois, and he told me, he says, you know what, why don't you try to go to dental school? I said, well, it's not so easy. I don't have any money, and I have no credentials. Everything is over there, and you can't find it. So I enrolled into the city colleges at Wilson Junior College. At that time, I don't think it exists anymore. And after 2-3 years, I got all my pre-dental courses under my belt. I applied to the 3 dental schools in Chicago, Illinois, Northwestern, Loyola. Loyola Northwestern isn't there anymore, but the University of Illinois is there, and I became a freshman in 1957. In 1960, I, of course, as a young dental student, I was kind of hot. There were a lot of young girls on the campus, you know. They were all looking for young dentists or physicians. And there was a young girl who learned to become some technician, medical technician. And we started dating, and at the end of my junior year, we got married. And in 1961, I graduated from the University of Illinois with the degree of DDS, and I became Dr. Brent. Well, who would have thought it, right? Well, anyway, I became a dentist. And I said to myself, now we got to have a family. I mean, after I lost so many people in the war, my little brother, I need a boy. I got to have a boy. So we started having a family. And in 62, we got our first child. It was a girl, Dawn. So I said, well, one is only one. Then we'll try again. 1965, 2, another girl. Sari. I said, no, 2, maybe 3 is a charm. We're going to have a third one. It's going to be a boy. No, 67, we had a girl, Pamela. So we have 3 girls now. And then I said, well, this is enough. But somehow it wasn't enough because in 1970 we had another child, another girl. So I had now 4 daughters. And they all are well. They married well. They all have 2 children each. And out of the 8 grandchildren, 5 of them are boys. So I finally got my boys. So before I finish, I just want to show you a couple of pictures here, if I may. I'm taking up too much time, I know, but it's always the problem. This is the country that I'm from. This is Hungary. It's an old map. Técső is in the northeastern corner there, where Munkács, Uzsgorod is, and so on and so forth. And this is a picture taken from the Auschwitz album. I said I will... The chaos at the train arrival. This is the way it looked. This is a real picture taken by the SS of an arriving transport. You can see the SS. You can see the people with the striped uniform mixed in there with them. You can see the men separated from the women. And you can see that there's also another column that you cannot quite see, but you can see the SS with their sticks walking around. There is the officer. Oops, what happened? Oh, there. Let's go back. There's the officer standing there who is the one doing the selection. They see an old woman being sent to the other side. There are the SS standing around. There is a guy, a prisoner in the striped uniform helping out with the selection. But that's what was going on. With 3 transports a day in Auschwitz-Birkenau. And it's going on all night, day and night, for about 2 months. 2.5 months, 10 weeks. I opened the book. I found this Auschwitz album in 1981. And I said, pictures of Auschwitz. Who the hell took pictures of Auschwitz? Well, I found out the SS did that. So I started coming through the pages, and I come up on this page, And who do I see standing there with a hat and glasses and a winter coat? It's my dad. See, my father, as we got off the train, I remember they separated the physicians and professional people on one side, and there's my father standing there. I go further, and I say, well, if he's there, I must be there somewhere too. This is a little bit later, when they took our civilian clothing away, they cut our hair, and we're standing in our underwear, and then I'm looking closely, and way in the corner there, you see a little guy with a dark hair right over there. Next to my dad, you can see my dad completely sort of cut off, but that's me. So I found myself as well. And there's the barracks that we were housed in Auschwitz-Birkenau. This Auschwitz album, by the way, is available if you want it. It's available from Yad Vashem. You can order it from Israel. And it tells you the whole story of this one transport. There's pictures of this one transport arriving May 26 or 27, 1944. And then I go further and I see my dad now has his striped uniform on the right here. They took his glasses away, of course, his hair is cut. And a close-up here, you can see him in the corner here again. And then I show you, this is Auschwitz, where I was from, and then they shipped us to Mauthausen, and a little bit further down is Ebensee in Austria. It's a beautiful place. We have on a vacation there. It's a Salzkammergut, it's a lovely place. And I went back to Auschwitz 2 years ago with a group of students from the College of Ozarks. And they had, I'm not talking into that thing. After I came back, the Auschwitz is now a Polish museum. Thousands of people come to see what Auschwitz looked like. So I sent them an email. I said, do you have any evidence of me being there? Hardcore evidence. So they sent me back by email a list. It says we couldn't find anything in Auschwitz because things were destroyed, but we have a list of people who were shipped from Auschwitz on January 15, 1945 to Mauthausen. And amongst them, you see with the red dot, I marked it, Balasha George, there I am, born on August 30, I said 26, I born 29, I just lied because I wanted to make myself older. And they tell you Ungarische Jude, UJ means Ungarische Jude, Hungarian Jew, Student meaning I was a Schüler or a student, and whatever. You see a lot of this there, that they have dates and the word GEST meaning gestorben. They listed the people who died. So anyway, I have evidence now of the fact that I really was there. The Germans were very, very thorough in documenting everything. And later on, I found a list of my uncle, too, who unfortunately passed away 3 days before liberation. I went to look for him, and he died. So he had a prophecy. He said that you're going to make it, but I won't. Well, he was right. Anyway, that is my story. I want you to remember, never forget what I told you, and don't let it happen again. This is really my message. It was a horrible thing, genocide, Holocaust. In Hebrew, they say Yizakor, don't forget, remember. So remember what I told you. It was an awful time, but thank God I came to this wonderful country, and with the help of many people, because you never make it alone, with the help of my uncle, with my uncle in the camp, with the dentist I met who gave me the direction to become a dentist, and other people along the way, I made it to this day when I'm here standing in front of you telling my story. So thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
I've had the opportunity to speak to a number of groups, but I will tell you that George is a very hard act to follow. My story is not quite as dramatic as George. In fact, by far, it's not as dramatic, and I admire the fact that he has such a great memory and that he can recall all of these facts and things that occurred to him over life, but I'm sure they're scarred within him. Anyway, as the director told you, my name's Arthur Sheridan. I was born in the city of Chicago and went to school there, went to Senn High School. And when I graduated from Senn High School, my father at that time had a small factory on the south side of Chicago that made small electrical appliances. And my father wanted me to be an electrical engineer. So it wasn't my calling, really. I knew I was very poor math. Had a hard time even getting out of high school with my math. But in any event, I followed my father and my mother's wishes, and I joined or entered what was then the Armour Institute of Technology, which today is the Illinois Institute of Technology. And we're now talking about 1943, as I recall. So I went to school for a few months, and I realized it was not my cup of tea. I either had to change or I'd get flunked out. So I went to my mother and dad and said, I'd like to join the Army. All of my friends are in the Army. I'd been in the ROTC, and I thought I knew all about it. I also wanted to fly, and ultimately they said, yes, you can enlist. So when I was 17, I enlisted in the Army and then found out I had a colorblind problem, so I couldn't fly. I was then sent into the infantry, went through basic at Fort Benning, Georgia, and somewhere along the line, I took some kind of a test, and I apparently did very well in it because I was then sent to Indiana University in a program the Army had then, I think was called ASTP, Army Specialized Training Program. And we went to Indiana. We were still in the service. We wore uniforms and so on. And I remember getting off the train. We were greeted by a number of ladies in white outfits, and I, like most every soldier, said, well, how much KP do we have? And she said, none. And I looked at her, and I said, how much guard duty do we have? And none. All we had to do was go to school. Now, they housed us in the girls' dormitory, but I will tell you we were very disappointed. The girls were made to move. And that's, one of the fallacies of the Army life, I will tell you. In any event, spent a few months in that school, in those courses. And can any of you have any idea of what the course was? Electrical engineering. Now, very fortunate for me, the program was disbanded before I was, and I was sent into the Armored Infantry at Camp Campbell, Kentucky. We trained there for several months. I became an infantryman again in an armored unit, and we moved about basically in half-tracks, or we did a lot of marching in that time. I was trained as a sniper and a scout. We ultimately were sent overseas as a unit. We were in the 20th Armored Division, and I was in the 60th Infantry Battalion of the 20th Armored Division. We had infantry, we had tanks, we had artillery, we had medics, we had everything that 20,000 men more or less could move with. We were shipped to Europe. We came a little late in the war, so we didn't have to go on the beaches. And by the way, I will tell you that those folks who went on those beaches are the true heroes of this war. In any event, we landed at Le Havre. We sailed around for a while because there were submarines out there, and our convoy was being moved about to try to avoid the area. But ultimately, we landed at Le Havre, at a port, and at a dock. We camped outside of Le Havre for a few weeks until all of our vehicles and our equipment got together, and then we set off into France, Belgium, Holland, and then ultimately into Germany. We didn't have much combat very early, but as we got further into Germany, just beyond Aachen, we ran into some resistance and had some combat. Subsequent to that, we went a little bit further down, and in an armored division, you can be through several of the armies. We ultimately got into the 3rd Army, General Patton's Army, and I remember that very distinctly because I recalled another colonel that came into our group, and he said, you're in General Patton's Army, and I want you to understand 3 things. Keep your collars buttoned, your sleeves rolled down, And if you ever get to a town that doesn't have a white flag in every village, every building, I want you to put the roofs into the cellars. And we had the firepower to do that. Very fortunately, we didn't have to do that very seldom. Most of the time as we were rolling along, we ran into little resistance at that time and went through many of the towns. We were sent back to relieve some of the, reinforce some of the groups during the Battle of the Bulge, and we had some opposition at that time, and our unit was involved in combat. And I'm not going to tell you a lot about combat because this basically is a story of people who suffered like George and their circumstance. We crossed the Rhine at Koblenz, and then we started going down to the south along the east side of the Rhine River and went through several of the towns, Würzburg, Traunstein, a number of smaller towns that we went through. George spoke of those caves, and one of our jobs was to go through some of those caves to see if we found, one, any troops that were hiding and any armament that we needed to destroy. Very fortunately, and I don't remember which town it was, I think it was either Würzburg or Traunstein, we went into one of those caves, and would you believe we liberated a brewery. Lots of kegs and kegs of beer. Now, the interesting thing about that, the Army, needed water, but more importantly, we needed beer. So we emptied all of our 5-gallon water cans and filled them with beer. And in that particular town, I remember we were sent outside of that town to camp again and get more ammunition and more gas. Remember that we needed gasoline to move on, and oftentimes as we moved very quickly, we sometimes outran our supply. Occasionally we were lucky and we'd run into a German gasoline dump and we could fill our tanks that way. In any event, the next day we wanted to go back to that town to get some more beer. But the military governor had come and taken charge of that town, and we had early on been issued little square green invasion money. They were 5-franc notes. Well, that military governor, that whatever, insisted on collecting 5 pfennigs for every 5-gallon can of beer that we acquired. In any event, we went further down, and ultimately our task was to, we were getting into toward the end of the war, like about May. We were then, I believe, in the 7th Army by that time. And our task was to back up the 42nd and 45th, or the 42nd and 45th Infantry Division in taking Munich. But as we went down this road, we came upon an encampment, a big camp with fencing around it and so on. We didn't know what it was, and we went through the wall to see what that was and found out we were then in a concentration camp. We had just entered the Dachau concentration camp. Now, you have to keep in mind that I'm speaking of 17, 18, 19, probably we were 18 or 19-year-old soldiers at that time. Our non-coms and our officers, of course, were much older. But we didn't know anything about concentration camps and what they entailed. We'd passed many camps on the way that were emptied. They'd gone before us, and there were prisoner of war camps that were emptied. There was this one camp outside of a village we went to that was been previously occupied by the prisoners from the Jersey Islands. These were Englishmen that were taken very, very early in the war. Fortunately for us, they took over that town and made it easy for us to get through there. In any event, we went into this camp, which we later learned was called Dachau. And what we saw were a great number of people, as George described, emaciated in striped uniforms, who didn't understand what we were or who we were either. And then came at us as kind of a group being inquisitive, but originally it frightened us to begin with because we didn't know what it was. We'd not been briefed. Nobody told us about concentration camps or things like that. After a while, we kind of understood what it was, and as we moved through the camp, almost all of their guards had left. I think there were 3 or 4 in a watchtower. which we were sorely wishing to abuse, but by and large, let's say we didn't do that. There were rail cars along the tracks there, and there were heaps of bodies, dead bodies, in those cars. They were just filled to the brim with dead people. There were dead bodies alongside the railroad tracks, and there were barracks that looked terrible, that stunk, that were full of feces, that had rodents all over the place. It was a really terrible, horrible place that George and people like him had lived in camps. George was not, I think, in Dachau, but he understood exactly what that was about. And again, we're kids. We're punks. We don't know what that's all about, but we know we have to help, and we have limited supplies. So what food we could get our mess people to bring up, we started to give people, and then we were realizing that we can't feed these people because the kind of food we have is not what they're ready to eat. We also tried to do some medical work on people with the few medics that we had. We didn't have a hospital unit with us, and we did what little we could, but understanding that we could do more harm maybe than good at that point. Our issue was to secure that camp and then move on to our objectives. The next day, the camp was being filled with people who could bring food, medics, and supplies to these people. Some of the prisoners had in the camp had run out when we came through some of the walls that we made holes in, and we had to go out in the countryside and pick them up and bring them back into camp so they could be cared for. The people in the city of Dachau, the village of Dachau nearby, everybody that we ran into would put their hands up and say, "Nix Nazi, gut Deutsch," which in German is, I'm not a Nazi, I was a good German. But how you could live in that town near this camp with the odors and the stench that would go on still to this day amazes me. In any event, that was our experience in liberating. They call that liberating a concentration camp. That word kind of offends me to some degree because we were soldiers. We were merely doing our job. To call us liberators is a little bit beyond the pale. The one nice thing that did occur, we know later on, there was a plaque put on the wall of Dachau that commemorated the 20th Armored Division being among the, quote, liberators of Dachau. But then we then moved out after a day and a half and went on and helped capture Munich. We then moved further into South Germany, into Bavaria. The war ended just outside of Munich for us, but we went on almost into Austria. We camped there. One of our jobs was taking munitions off the bridge across the Salzach River. And then we were ordered to get rid of our ammunition. So we had big holes dug, and we filled it with our ammunition. We set explosives in it, and very slowly and carefully walked out. You didn't want to run because if you tripped, you might not get out before that fuse would take off. We were moved on then into the Berchtesgaden area. We went up to Hitler's home. We were set to guard I think it was Goering or Goebbels train that was in the station, a really magnificent train. And then ultimately, we were sent to a town that I don't recall the name of, and we were asked to board probably the same boxcar that George came in. There were either 40 men in these boxcars or 8 horses. Well, we didn't have horses, so we had 40 men. And we rode those boxcars all the way back to France, to Le Havre. We had an interesting experience on the way. In one city, our train matched up with another train going the other direction. They both were stopped, and we looked in the other boxcar, and it was full of cases of canned fruit and tomatoes. Now, those also needed to be liberated because we just couldn't let them sit there. So we, of course, liberated those cases, but unfortunately, like George's people experienced, we weren't used to a lot of pineapple or tomatoes and things like that. So by the time we got back to Lahar, I wound up in the hospital with many of the things that George was talking about. I stayed there for about, our outfit stayed in that area for about 5 days, and then two of my buddies, as a sniper, I had a backup fellow who kind of watched my butt to make sure nobody could catch me. And he and another friend of mine, both of them from Chicago, came to the hospital, kind of walked me out of it, had a Jeep, walked me to the port, drove me to the port, and then walked me up the gangplank of that ship. Because if I hadn't gone up with them, I would have been a casual, and I'd have to wait till a group of soldiers came together and be shipped back home. Fortunately, we went back home in a much larger ship than the one we went over. The one we went over was a small Liberty ship. Our mess was in the bottom of that ship, and every time the ship rolled, I had a bite of food from the guy next door, and I had my own food, and when it rolled the other way, I had a bite from the other fella. But we were all, buddies. We knew each other for a number of times at that point. We landed in New York. Was very happy to see the Statue of Liberty. Went into New Jersey to a camp there whose name I don't recall, and then we were fed great food. We had steaks and French fries, and do you know who served them to us? The very German prisoners that we had captured previously. Maybe not the same ones, but they were in camp there, and they were serving this marvelous food to us. We were admonished not to pick on the prisoners, and we didn't. We were then shipped by train all the way to California, to Camp Cook, California, where we were being trained to invade Japan, and very fortunately, the war ended, and we didn't go to Japan. I was ultimately shipped back to Camp McCoy and discharged there, and then started my civilian life. I've had many different careers, but one thing the Army did teach me, well, one of many things, is to be organized, to be determined, to use the best efforts I can to accomplish what I wanted to do, and to be able to stand up for myself. I later learned how to fly, and I was flying from 1946 until about 5 years ago when I was 85, and I decided I better stop because I wasn't as sharp as I wanted to be. Since then, now I jump out of airplanes at least twice a year. I wanted to find out, who wants to jump out of a perfectly good airplane. And I think it's a wonderful thing, except when I'm in the doorway of that airplane and I say, what the heck am I doing here? In any event, that's my story. I've had many careers. I've been in the entertainment business. I've been in the building business. I've owned a steel mill. I've gone broke a couple of times. I'm still involved in real estate in Aurora and president of a large real estate organization throughout the state of Illinois. And as the Lord is kind and my wife is good to me, I hope to be able to go on for a few more years. So thank you for listening.
So thank you, George and Art. Very powerful stories. Okay, so we've got time to take some questions. We do have microphones that we're going to pass because this is all being recorded, and it will be on our YouTube site later after it's been produced. So please wait until you have a microphone, and I'll call on people. And who's got the first question? Is that a hand in the back?
Paul, could they stand so we can see?
This is from my husband. He said, I'm interested in the reactions the public had to the reality of the Holocaust and the Jews. First at the beginning, and then when more people started to deny the Holocaust.
I guess this is directed to me, isn't it? Can you repeat the first part again? Sure. Make sure I understand the question.
I'm interested in the reactions the public had to the reality of the Holocaust and the Jews. First at the beginning, and then when people started to deny it.
Are you talking about in Europe or here in the United States?
Here in the U.S.
Here, yes. First of all, when I first came to the United States, for years, they didn't even know I was Jewish, except my doctor said H, Hebrew. I didn't talk about my experiences in the camps. I even denied being a Jew for many, many years at first. That somehow was inbred in me, knowing that the less they know about me, the longer I live, I guess. That's the way it was over there. And as far as denials go, I think, how can people deny what happened? What happened to 6 million souls? I mean, they went up in the clouds. I mean, they just disappeared. I mean, let's just bring it down to reality. My little brother was 10 years old. Had he survived, he knew his name, he knew what he was. You would have heard something about him. My mother, she was a grown woman, 42 years old, healthy. Obviously, had she survived, they would have known about it. And the same thing about all the other people who were killed. What happened to all these people? They just didn't disappear in thin air. So how can they deny the fact? I mean, there's so much evidence that Germans documented everything. If you look at some of the documents, before the extermination camps opened, the so-called Einsatzgruppen that went around after the war broke out with the Soviet Union, it went from village to village, rounding up the Jews and shooting them in the forest, in the mass graves. And the population themselves helped out with that. In the Ukraine, in Lithuania, the people of Lithuania, they helped killing the Jews. Nobody liked us. And if you look today, what's happening in France just not too long ago, what's happening in Hungary, Hungary is a terribly anti-Semitic place. The last election, 20% of the elected people belong to the so-called Jobbik party, which is a far-right fascist party. So I guess people just didn't learn. Anti-Semitism isn't something new. It's been going on for ages. We were always persecuted. I mean, look at the history. I always say that there are villages, there are people who never met a Jew, but they hate Jews. So what happened? Why? They must have gotten for the mother's milk. I don't know how the heck they otherwise can explain the fact. But there are people, really, there are little towns in Europe, villages, there were no Jews at all, but they hated Jews. They were called Christ killers. They were called all kinds of things that they blamed the Jews for. In Germany, they blamed the loss of World War I to the Jews, that they stabbed them in the back. That was Hitler's thing. Of course, the economy was horrible, and Hitler helped rebuild Germany and then go to war. And that's why a lot of Germans liked him first. But anyway.
Okay. You're in the second row.
Yes. What made you begin to tell your story and be more vocal about it as a survivor?
Me?
Yes. Well, both of you, I'd like to know what caused you to both tell your stories.
Well, I tell you, I practiced dentistry for 50 years. I didn't really speak much about my experiences. Matter of fact, there are classmates of mine that never even know that I was in a camp. After I retired, I felt, what am I going to do? My wife says, well, you have a story to tell. Why don't you go to the Holocaust Museum and offer to talk to the people? So I did that. And after I pulled out the Auschwitz album and I was showing them that I am in the picture of me and my dad, oh, well, they found a treasure, they thought. And so they put me on the list of speakers. And I've been doing it for the past 2-3 years since I retired about 4 years ago. So I've been doing this since then. And so that's why.
It's interesting that George mentioned that his wife is the one that got him started, because my wife did that to me also. I, too, am Jewish. I belong to a temple in Aurora, and normally we Jewish people celebrate or honor the Holocaust every year. And in some congregations where there are still Jewish people who have been part of that are alive, they will tell their story or some part of it. in this congregation, there weren't any left. And so somebody had understood my story of being in the Army, and at one point our group liberated Dachau, and they went to my wife, not me, my wife, and asked if Art would tell the story. And I think right behind the fellow with the is the gentleman who, if I recognize him, convinced my wife to tell the story. Is that you, Phil, back there? Yeah. In any event, I did that one time at the temple. They were kind enough to record it. And then our group went to the Holocaust Museum in Skokie, I'm going to say 4 months ago. Now, remember, I spoke about it at the temple maybe 5 years ago. So that means 60 years since I was discharged and I wasn't talking about anything. Most soldiers in the Second World War did not speak of their experiences. It just wasn't in it. We came back, we wanted to start our life, wanted to forget it. I didn't want to re-enlist. I didn't belong to any veterans organization or anything like that. So in any event, we went to visit the Holocaust Museum, and as I went through the museum and I noticed some of the pictures and I could comment about this was this and that was that, and I remember this, the docent asked if I would talk also, and I got poked by my wife, and I said yes, and so they've invited me to come and speak, and I've been speaking there probably for the last 2-3 months, once or twice a month. So that's really how that came about. But the important thing is that I have the opportunity of speaking mostly to young people. I actually had a group about a week ago from the West Aurora High School, which are my neighbors. You know, I started saying, "Hi, neighbor," because I knew some of the kids. In any event, the important thing was the opportunity to me, not just to tell the story of the war, and I don't want to talk a lot about combat or killing people or trying not to be killed or the concentration camps really and the death people, but to make people, particularly the young people, understand what has gone before, what's going on today, and that it's in their particular hands and ours through education to teach them to go on to make a better life for everybody. That, to me, is what's important.
Excellent. Okay, there's a question in the back here.
After such a traumatic experience, how did you put the past in the past? How did you move forward with your life? And how did you deal with your anger? And did you ever find peace?
Talking about me?
Yes.
I think that question is for you, George.
For me? It's a funny thing. I have there's a sort of wall in my memory. Some people can account every day they spent in a concentration camp, day by day what happened. I can't. I know where I was. I know the highlights, the horrors, but I cannot tell you exactly what happened. I have memory problems of remembering things. Try as hard as I can to remember my mother and my brother. I can't. I'm trying very hard. I have pictures of them, and that's the only connection I have. But I'm trying to dream with them. I want to remember some of the things we did together. I cannot do it. I've been in therapy. I've done all kinds of things to try to bring back memories. I cannot do it. Some people say, "You're lucky. You don't want to remember the horrors." Maybe. I would like to know more or remember more about my life that happened. Of course, I was 14 years old, so in a long life, that's a pretty short time, really. And if you think about it, I mean, the first 5 years or so, although they say early recollections are important before you are 5 years old, I don't remember a thing about it, honest to God. A little bit about that my brother was born, but that's about it. So it's a blessing, but it's a curse at the same time.
There's a question here in the front.
Question, Mr. Sheridan. When did you come to terms with actually what you experienced in Dachau? Was there a certain point in your life when you realized, wow, it was much more than just being an 18, 19-year-old soldier going in there and, as you said, liberating, not necessarily the right word, but when did you come to realize how that was so important rather than just a mission per se?
I began to realize the importance of what occurred probably in my mid-20s. However, it was all stuffed away. The only time that it really came to the fore was when I did that first talk at that temple and I got choked up. And to this day, anytime I speak about, or many times, I will get choked up. When the vision of those bodies and those men in such emaciated condition comes to mind, it just troubles me. But it took me a long time before that part you stuff came up, and I became old enough and man enough to be able to talk about it and deal with it.
There's a question here in the second row.
To Mr. Sheridan, did you realize at a certain time that the people that you were liberating were fellow Jews?
I'm sorry, we're what?
Fellow Jews?
I didn't think of it that way. I had very little religious training as a young man, so religion was not foremost in my mind. I had a poor experience in a congregation at a temple in Chicago when I was a little kid, and I never went back. I had no religion on my dog tags, so that didn't really bear. The thing that helped was the fact that we spoke some of that Yiddish or German in our house as a kid. My dad spoke to me and taught me some of it, so I could understand what some of these people were saying, these prisoners, as they came to me. But it wasn't because I was Jewish. It was simply because they were human beings. And again, put yourself in the mind of an 18-year-old who's just learning how to get along in his own life and staying alive. So it took a long time for it to make a difference as, quote, a Jew.
May I just say something about that? People think that only Jews were in the camps. There were countless other people from other countries, all the occupied countries by the Nazis. There were French, there were Poles, there were Greeks, there were Dutch, there were, of course, Jews, the majority of them, maybe. But there were people, homosexuals, there were Jehovah's Witnesses, asocials, anybody who didn't fit into the Aryan mold that Hitler visioned the world to be in was in a concentration camp. That was a sentence you got without a release. I mean, they put you in a camp. There was nobody told you you're going to be there for 2 years or 1 year. You were there till you died or you were liberated, period.
Population of Dachau was well split up. Of course, there were Jews, there were Poles, there were French people. One of the prisoners I had learned very recently in life was the Prime Minister of Hungary, Mikhail Tali. And I found that out because one of my friends here in this area who works for NICAR, that was his great-grandfather. And we were discussing this at one time, and he said, my great-grandfather was there. And that was Mikhail, who perished in Dachau, and he was just the prime minister. Politically, he was not in favor.
And we'll take a last question in the front row right here.
Mr. Sheridan, I was wondering, you mentioned during your presentation of the smell and how we could smell it in the village of Dachau. How far away was it, even looking back, that you could smell that something just wasn't as it should be?
The village was almost adjacent to the camp, in my recollection. And at one point, After the camp had been secured, I was sent into the village and with another soldier, and we were, call it guarding an intersection. But I could smell that probably 10 blocks at most away.
The Germans, who were so close to these camps, pretended that there was no camp. When I went back in the 80s, first time I went back to see Mauthausen, it took me, I don't know how long before I found the camp. I asked people in Linz and near Mauthausen, how do I get to Mauthausen? They all played dumb, like they don't know. Ebensee, all they have left is a memorial, and it's all built up around there with developments, with people walking along, beautiful homes. And they have no idea what was under the ground where they were walking under. There were thousands and thousands of people who were were dead or kept alive or whatever happened there. And they denied it. To them it was like, well, what was Mauthausen? What's Ebensee? Yeah. I think the Germans slowly can come to grips with it, the new generation. We have, at the museum, we have some interns. One is from Austria and one is from Germany, 2 young men. They change every year, sometimes women, sometimes men. And they are sent here by the Reconciliation Council of whatever it is, the country, Germany or Austria. These young kids come here, financed by the people back in Germany or Austria, and they work without salary. They take care of things that the kids coming in there who we talk to, get the slides ready. They're very nice to us. And I asked them, he says, how do your parents and your grandparents feel about this? And he says, well, my parents are pretty well accepted the fact what happened. But I still know of some of my grandparents still think Hitler was a great man, and that maybe these things weren't all as bad as they sound, and so on and so forth. So denial, don't want to measure, they want to admit. And Germany is the only country that pays restitution to the Jews, really. And some of them who are really injured and are sick, they got a certain amount of money every month for life. I applied for some because now they give money to people who are born who were born before 1928, I think. I haven't heard anything from them. I figured, when you get older, they wait till you get so old that they don't have to pay you very long, Really, they wait. Maybe I'll get my money the day before I die, or maybe after I die, nobody will give it to me. But that's the case. Hungary, they wouldn't, nothing. I put in a claim. They gave me $140 for my mother and $70 for my brother. That's it. And it took me years to get them to admit that something happened.
Well, because both of you gentlemen, these many, many, many years later, are still willing to come to events like this, not just here, but all over, and talk about your story. You have over 200 more people who know this story, and you know it from the witnesses who lived through it. I have a couple of administrative announcements to make before we're done here, but thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, very quickly, I think we've got a couple slides up there, Rich. So this is our next couple of events here on June 25th with the Russians at the front. That's the Eastern Front of World War I. This is in collaboration with the Robert R. McCormick Museum, which is the Colonel's home. And we have some footage recently uncovered in the archives that Colonel McCormick himself made when he was a war correspondent on the Eastern Front in 1915, before the United States got into the war and before he got into the U.S. Army. And then on July 1st, we'll have an author here. His name is Matt Davenport. He's written a wonderful book. It's the best I've written so far, called First Over There, and it's about the 1st Division at the Battle of Cantigny. And I certainly hope that you'll come for that. Finally, We don't ask you to, we don't charge you to come to these things, but Cantini Post 556, the American Legion, represented by Tom Wills in the back, comes to every one of these to ask you to consider a donation in the red, white, and blue mailbox to the Midwest Shelter for Homeless Veterans. One of the challenges we have in the United States today is we have 50,000 honorably discharged veterans living on our streets. And there is a wonderful institution in Wheaton that's trying to do something about it in DuPage County and in our area, and we support them, and we invite you to do so as well. Finally, this
Paul,
program...
May I interrupt? There's also a
Yes, sir.
home for veterans in Aurora also who have served and who have no place to live, and I hope that Paul will consider sometime or other adding that to his list.
Yes, sir. Art has joined a veterans organization since those long ago days when he came home from the war. I'm proud to say it is the American Legion, and I've talked to him about maybe moving his membership over to Cantini Post 556. He'll think about it. I'll think about that other homeless shelter. This program was in collaboration with the Illinois Holocaust Museum in Skokie, Illinois. If this has piqued your interest and you want to know more about it, there's a million ways that you can learn more about the terrible but important history of the Holocaust. But I can't think of a better way than to take a Saturday or Sunday, drive up to Skokie, and go through that powerful, moving, terrible, but wonderful museum. And they do a great deal of good, and we all ought to support that institution as well. Finally, as a very inadequate token of gratitude to both of our speakers, I have the last two. Every year, we produce a commemorative coin for the 1st Division Museum. There's a long history of these coins, and every year it's different. On one side is the logo of the 1st Division Museum, which has an oak leaf on it for Cantini, which was once red oaks, and also the emblem of the Big Red One. And on the back, some historical incident from the history of the 1st Division that we commemorate. It's particularly fitting, I think, that these two gentlemen get the last two 2014 coins, because in 2014 we commemorated the Normandy landings in June of 1944. The scene on the back is a very famous one of GIs getting off a landing craft and headed toward eternity on Omaha Beach. They are soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division. And that is where the liberation began. Both of you are heroic for having survived what you did, and we are delighted that you did, but we want you both to have this as a token of our gratitude that you were with us here today. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming. I hope you'll join us on those other dates, and both of our speakers will stay for a few minutes in case someone wants to come up and ask a question they didn't get an opportunity to. Thank you very much.